BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, it's Anna Hill here with the Farming Today podcast, where we find out what crofters in Scotland are hoping for in a new government bill. A sheep industry task force is underway in Northern Ireland to give more support to hill farmers. And how do you measure greenhouse gas emissions from fishing and aquaculture?
When we're talking about wild-caught fish, the fuel consumed during the fishing represents the largest component of the carbon footprint. When we're talking about farmed aquaculture species, it's the feed production and consumption that represents the most significant element.
We'll have more on that a little later. First, though, to Northern Ireland, where a special sheep industry task force has been set up to help farmers because they feel they need more support. Agriculture is devolved, which means all four nations in the UK are working separately towards transitioning from former EU payments to a new system. Under the post-Brexit plan in Northern Ireland, there's funding for beef and arable and environmental schemes, but there's currently little specific sheep support. And some sheep farmers, particularly those in severely disadvantaged areas or SDAs, say they could go out of business. Helen Mark met up with the Ulster Farmers Union's Kelly Rouse and the union's deputy president Glenn Cuddy as he was preparing his ewes for topping, or as it's said in the local dialect, tipping.
Today they'll be sorted out here, tails clipped, and they get a mineral drench. They give them a boost before they go to the ram.
The whole cycle starting again.
The whole cycle starting again. It seems no time from the lambing to the tipping.
Can you describe what the task force actually is?
Well, I suppose it was set up on the back of changes that was coming in future support for farmers. We were losing money out of our single farm payment to fund beef schemes and an arable scheme. But our problem is we have seen no schemes from DAERA for sheep.
So if you're a sheep only farmer, you're going to be losing 17% of your basic payment scheme going into a beef scheme, suckler cow scheme and a protein scheme for a sustainability payment and a farming for nature payment. For sheep farmers, farming in SDA lands, a lot of them, farming cattle or farming arable is not possible. So if you are a sheep only farmer, you cannot make up that 17%. Keeping young people in the industry is difficult enough, never mind not having future support for them.
You're a young sheep farmer yourself?
Yes, I farm a hill farm, so I do at home. So 17% is a serious loss when your basic payment scheme is so relied on.
So are our sheep farmers on less favoured land? Are they going to be the worst hit by this?
The farmers, especially in uplands, on a sheep-only farm, will be hit severely. Even on the lowland farms, why would you keep sheep if you could get more support by keeping beef cattle? That's a change away from sheep again. We have processors that has built up businesses on sheep, and if we have less lambs coming through, there's less employment. If you go to some of our marts, there would be a sheep in it, the town's buzzing. You know, we don't want to lose that out of the rural economy. We face the problem of more and more sheep farmers will decide to do something else. We don't want that. We don't want to see sheep disappearing off our hills and our ground that's more difficult to farm.
It's not a small sector, is it?
No, there's about 17,500 beef and sheep and about 3,000 sheep only farmers. The Sheep Task Force was formed in autumn 2022 because it was left out of the future agricultural policy. We didn't have a storm mount at the time, so DAERA civil servants couldn't do anything until a minister returned. So we have been having some good and progressive meetings. We're not just asking for a payment for doing nothing. You know, we want to focus on our sheep health and welfare. We want to focus on sheep genetics. We would like a bespoke capital investment scheme so that sheep farmers could actually avail of some help that could actually progress their businesses forward. We want to work on environmental schemes for sheep. We're going to still keep pushing and try our best to get some kind of support for the industry.
There's no point in having it later because then the damage will be done. We want to get it done and dusted and stop the accident from sheep.
Glenn Cuddy from the UFU. Well, the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland told us officials are currently working to better understand the strategic needs of this sector. It said a number of the planned farm support and development programme measures will be available to sheep farmers. Any decision to introduce new policies or programmes will be in the context of budget availability, including the requirement to demonstrate clear value for money. Now, all this week we're looking at what Scotland's new agricultural legislation means for the farming industry there, and today specifically for the crofting sector. Crofting is a system of landholding unique to Scotland, where small parcels of land, on average about 12 acres, are normally held in tenancy. Crofters have rights to things like fair rent and security of tenure, but they also have a duty to live on or near to the croft and to put the land to purposeful use. The Scottish Government is consulting on a new Crofting Bill aimed at making it easier for people to get into crofting and to support things like peatland restoration and environmental work on crofts. Nancy Nicholson has been to the unveiling of a new monument on the Western Isles built to commemorate 100 years since the resettling of 52 crofting families in the area after people were forced to leave during the Highland clearances.
We're here just outside this tremendous dry stone monument, which has been built to commemorate a pretty momentous event in the history of this village 100 years ago. It's about encouraging people to really kind of reflect, but also think ahead.
This is Galston Estate, which is just a few miles south of the northernmost point of the Western Isles. Agnes Rennie is chair of the community-owned estate trust, which looks after 56,000 acres, no less. And you talked about momentous legislation, Agnes. There's other legislation in the pipeline, consultations for the Crofting Bill. Will that legislation be as powerful, as important as it was 100 years ago?
I wish my answer to that question was yes, but I fear not. Anything I've seen so far, and indeed meetings that I've attended, have really led me to confirm my own thinking that once again we're going to see some tinkering with legislation. And tinkering never achieves great change. But what we need now for crofting really being at a crossroads, it requires transformational legislation, and that needs to be taking bold steps. And I don't believe that is what we're about to get.
Can you put in a nutshell what you mean, the key elements of what bold would be?
We need to somehow find a way of recognising that turning croft land simply into a commodifiable entity which is bought and sold on the market to provide homes with nice views is not the intention. It never was the intention. And without taking some very, very radical steps, that's what's going to happen. And for those who work the land, use the land and live on the land as their permanent homes, that is becoming increasingly more difficult.
Yeah, so we'll put your sheep down there afterwards, David, when we're done with this lot.
It's a blustery November morning and crofters have been gathering their ewes and rams ready for tapping to ensure a new crop of lambs next spring, and among them is Donald McKinnon, who's a director and the past chair of the Scottish Crofting Federation. Donald, it's the weekend because you all have other jobs that you have to do and you have to fit the crofting around that. Has this new legislation brought any comfort, any confidence, any support to you?
We're still trying to get our heads around the changes in the coming down the road in the Agriculture Bill, but also in the future policy that's emerging alongside it. At the moment, the main area of discussion is around the whole farm plan and how we're going to be able to comply with those conditions in 2025. And on the whole, for us, that probably looks like being able to have an animal health and welfare plan in place and looking at the habitat plans. But there's still a bit of uncertainty about how we manage to achieve that for small producers. But that's something that I hope the government are going to take on board, that as they're continuing to develop new policy, they need to make sure that these changes are proportional, that what they're expecting small producers and crofters like ourselves to do actually relates to the size of our businesses.
When we talk about the Scottish industry, it's always farmers and crofters. You're often the second fiddle, aren't you?
Yeah.
In the policy.
If Scottish Government are going to hit their targets, if they're going to meet peatland restoration targets for biodiversity, keep people living in a place like this and keep this kind of community going, then they're going to have to invest in crofting. They're going to have to make sure that the future agricultural policy works for crofters and for crofting.
That report from Nancy Nicholson. The consultation on the Crofting Bill has now closed, and the Scottish Government says the responses will be analysed and inform future crofting law reform. Now, as environmentalists, politicians and even farmers gather at COP29 in Azerbaijan, emissions and how to reduce them are at the top of the agenda for many delegates. We hear a lot about greenhouse gas emissions in farming, from cattle, soil disturbance and the use of fertilisers, but we don't often talk about fishing and aquaculture. Well, now the industry is using a seafood carbon emissions profiling tool to collate data from all along the supply chain, from farming or catching the fish in the wild, all the way through to processing and packing. Dr. Stuart McLanigan is head of responsible sourcing at Seafish, the public body which represents the fishing and seafood industry, which designed the profiling tool.
The tool very much requires seafood businesses to collaborate together to collect the necessary data to populate the tool. And it does that in that systematic, stepwise supply chain way. So the seafood from sort of wild caught, aquaculture production, through to processing, through to delivery to retail and food service.
And who's doing the counting? Who's doing the measuring?
The tool does all of the calculation, but however good the software is, of course, the beating heart of the tool is very much the quality data. And we are working with industry and industry's seafood supply chains to ensure data is collected in a systematic manner so that we can subsequently then start to make like-for-like comparisons in a meaningful way.
Now, we know this is being used at the moment by some people in the industry. Where is the biggest part of the carbon footprint coming from when you're supplying fish?
When we're talking about wild-caught fish, the fuel consumed during the fishing operation represents the largest component of the carbon footprint. When we're talking about farmed aquaculture species, it's the feed production and consumption that represents the most significant element. Shellfish aquaculture species such as mussels and oysters, these are species that very much filter their feed directly from the marine environment. They have the lowest overall footprint. But thereafter, what you do with seafood is highly important here. So, for example, if you add sunflower oil to shellfish or a fish fillet and then place that product in a can, that can then dominate the size of the overall carbon footprint.
So how do you gauge it? How would a consumer know what level of carbon footprint all these different products have?
There is also a public-facing area of the tool where the general public can get a good appreciation of the comparison of one type of seafood product compared with another. Whether that's an aquaculture product compared with for example, a wild-caught species, or whether that is a product in a tin with sunflower oil as opposed to just a straightforward fillet. Whilst we are some way away from certified front-of-pack carbon labelling, this is an area Seafish is very actively involved in contributing towards.
And what about the industry itself? Now that you've got data that can show where hotspots are, what can the industry do itself to reduce emissions?
First and foremost, it's very much about measuring your carbon footprints, understanding where those hotspots, those carbon hotspots or risks are within the supply chain. It's very much then looking at initiatives, for example, moving to renewable energy use in processing, moving to some of the new and emerging types of cold chain that are very much more efficient.
Dr. Stuart McLanigan from Seafish. That's all from us this morning. I'm Anna Hill. The producer was Heather Simons. Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.